In December of 1991, Super Castlevania IV was released in North America for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. In this video, we're going to take a look at why I think this game is a fucking amazing game, directed by Masahiro Ueno, or Jun Furano, because Konami being Konami didn't allow the use of real names at the time that this game was made. He was also the main programmer. This was his first 16-bit game, and it is possible but not confirmed that Ueno and his team started development on the title in 1989. Being a fan of the original Castlevania for the NES, Ueno wanted to make an action game that was similar to it and consider Super Castlevania IV a remake of the original game. There was some confusion over this because in Japan the game was clearly marketed as a remake, as the prologue text confirms, and it retells Simon Belmont's story of his first quest to rid the world of Dracula. In North America, however, this game was marketed as, and the story in the game changed to make it a sequel to Castlevania and Castlevania II Simon's Quest. It never really made sense how it was a sequel, but it's neither here nor there. Could be a translation thing, or they just thought it would sell better if it was considered a sequel in North America. Ueno added many features to the classic 2D Castlevania gameplay, most notably using the whip to latch onto rings that are placed in some stages and being able to swing across gaps in the floor, or in one level, hang from the ring as the room rotates. The most notable and somewhat divisive feature is the ability to whip in 8 directions. Some fans love it, some think it makes the game too easy. Speaking of the difficulty, considering the high difficulty of Castlevania and Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, this game is actually pretty easy compared to those two. Except for the Room of Close Associates, because fuck that section. Moving on, the development team was small, so due to this everyone was involved in the design, and some ideas came out of the creative artists and programmers just experimenting. The team drew maps on paper, and the game changed and evolved as time went on. Mitsuru Yaida was the programmer responsible for Simon Belmont and the implementation of the whip system, which had the aforementioned 8-direction whipping. They had new gameplay that was not possible in the previous games due to limitations of the NES hardware. Ueno was an enemy and boss programmer and would conceptualize rough ideas, while those ideas would be implemented by other programmers who also made the bosses have more detailed patterns. The first bosses in the game were designed so that the players would be able to find strategies that were effective without having to deal with steep difficulty and having to retry. Basically, they wanted to ease you into the experience rather than punch you in the face right out of the gate. Outside of changing the game from being a remake to a sequel, there was some censorship involved as the game was ported for a Western release, like the removal of blood from Stage 8, the cross removed from the tombstone in the prologue, and the statues in Stage 6 were originally topless, but they, for some reason, still left Medusa's torso naked. So, snake women and boobs are okay, I guess? The story for Super Castlevania IV is pretty straightforward. Dracula has risen, monsters are sweeping across the land, Simon Belmont must make his way to Dracula's castle and vanquish the evil. There's no NPCs to interact with, so that's about all there is to cover for the story. Visually, this game looks great. An aesthetic that I always liked, especially as a kid, was the gothic horror look, heavily influenced by Hammer horror films and the old Universal classic monster movies. And the game just oozes with the feeling of death and decay as the countryside is ravaged by Dracula's minions. Each level is a unique and different design, with no two levels looking alike. The opening stages take place in the countryside leading to Dracula's castle, with later levels taking place inside the castle proper. Some of these inside levels are the most visually striking in the game. The main hall is a dilapidated castle hall, and the entrance area of the once grand castle has now been neglected and is decaying. The treasury room is a level with golden jewels everywhere and spirits floating up from the floor, and the treasury level is probably one of the most visually striking levels in an SNES game, period. The basement is creepy and grimy, and the aforementioned Room of Close Associates, the final gauntlet of 3 bosses before facing Dracula himself, is both haunting and dangerous looking. Some levels have fog, scrolling backgrounds, mud, water. One level has you basically traversing through a stream or a small river with the current changing directions to try and throw you off balance. The clock tower level has turning gears and moving chains. I mean, there's so many little details and movements in these levels, it's easy to miss them, but if you take the time to really look, you appreciate the work that was put into each level. Some levels implemented Mode 7 effects in some levels, and while amazing at the time, and still pretty cool even now, Be prepared for some slowdown in those areas as the game engine buckles under the weight of everything going on screen. Speaking of slowdowns, a couple boss fights also suffer from this greatly. It's moments like this that can detract from an overall fun experience, but speaking of bosses, well, yes, a lot of them are easy. They are all mostly unique and visually impressive, from the skeletal soldier riding a skeletal horse in the opening level to the Medusa fight that I mentioned, all the way to Slogger on Death. All of the bosses look great and have distinct designs, some even being reused in later games like Symphony of the Night. Dracula looks much like the stereotypical depiction of Dracula everybody knows from Christopher Lee and Bela Lugosi depictions of the character on film. Death especially, though, has a great look in this game. His robes are tattered and he's slightly transparent. Really a cool look for the character, in all honesty. The sprites in this game are large and detailed. Simon Belmont being approximately twice the size he was in the NES game, you can make out individual pieces of his armor. While it's not as highly detailed as later games for a 16-bit game and compared to what we had gotten previously, it's a nice design choice as Simon and the enemies are easy to see and stand out from the background. Each level is accompanied by level-specific music, and this is one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time. This was a game that introduced us to the now iconic theme of Simon, and the last few stages feature remixes of Vampire Killer, Bloody Tears, and The Beginning. Each track a cut from each of the previous games. The MIDI music sounds good, even now, and gives the game a cinematic feel to it. The only negative I can level with the music is that the boss theme for the bosses inside the castle is probably a little bit more epic than some of the actual boss battles. Overall, while easier than previous games in the franchise, and later games, the game is a fun experience with a great soundtrack, striking visuals, and some interesting level design. Super Castlevania IV is available on the SNES if you still own one, and can also be found on the Nintendo digital stores for the Wii, Wii U, and the new Nintendo 3DS. It's also included on the SNES Classic Edition. This was an amazing game almost 30 years ago when it was released, and has held up well since then, standing the test of time that some games from that era do not. So if you have a means of playing this game and you haven't yet, give it a shot. You might be impressed. This is my personal favorite among the original side-scrolling Castlevania games before the Metroidvania style took over, and I can't recommend this game enough. So find a way to get your hands on it, go out there and kill some fucking monsters and end Dracula's reign of terror.